So I'm not sure if you have a format for these, the Patreon discussions specifically. I assume you've done a few, but I've prepared a few questions.
That's fine. I generally, my general assumption is that this is your half hour, and you're welcome to do whatever with it that you would like. And if you have questions, that would be perfectly fine.
Sure. Well, just to give you a little background, I tried to pick things that are sort of related to your work, which I've been following for some time now, but that I haven't heard you fully articulate before. So hopefully it's some interesting conversation. Before I get into the first question, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about how how I initially came across your work.
Yeah.
So it was maybe about a year ago. I was reading a lot of Schopenhauer, a lot of Nietzsche, and talking with some friends and people that I like to talk about with regard to those subjects. And I think somebody referred me to one of your existentialist videos in your personality course.
Mm-hmm.
So that then led to your personality course, and then to Maps of Meaning. And I'll say it was a pretty welcome find too, as I've kind of have been suffering from the you might call it the postmodern problem since I was about 15. It's always given me anxiety, still gives me anxiety, panic attacks, and so on. And obviously there are some other thinkers out there that have tried to approach something, or tried to approach that problem from different angles, but I found your work to be the most accessible in modern times and very helpful. So thanks for that.
Good.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I'm glad to hear that.
Awesome. So first question is something I've found particularly interesting. As I said, I have been listening for a little while to your lectures, and a good while before the whole PC dust-up that you got into recently. And you've been teaching about the dragon and gold story for a long time. I'm not sure how long, but it is a motif in some of your oldest videos.
Yeah.
And anyway, it seems to me that in the last few months, you sort of put on a real-life modern demonstration of that story, by my estimation. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. But in putting out the videos on the PC subject, and then you had this huge chaos blow up, I presume that affected your life in a lot of ways. But then out of that chaos, it seems to me that you found some gold. There's a much larger community building around your message. You have new opportunities arising, and obviously your financial support with regard to Patreon and in other arenas has swelled. So
yes, I think that's a reasonable summary of all of it.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty Shakespearean, because you've been teaching about it and then you kind of lived it a little bit.
Yes, it's pretty strange.
Yeah, but on to the question. Obviously, sometimes as people we act out archetypes intentionally, and sometimes we act out archetypes unintentionally.
Yeah.
And I remember in that first PC video you said that you were a little nervous doing it. Had that occurred to you that you were confronting a dragon, so to speak, and do you spend any time sort of meditating on common archetypes and pushing yourself toward acting them out, or was it just a happy accident?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say I don't think that the right way to think about it is as an accident.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that I knew what I was awakening.
Right.
There was no way of knowing that.
Right.
I had the intuition that it was a monster, because I felt that many of the things that were happening at the institutional level, at various levels of the institutional hierarchies, was that there was something deeply wrong with it.
Right.
At that point, I had some intuition that broader range of issues was also part of the dynamic that was playing out in the Trump versus Hillary contest, and also in Europe, with the rise of the nationalist, and with France and with Holland, but I certainly didn't know that my stated refusal to comply with a certain rather minor policy transformation in Canada was going to have the overwhelming consequences that it did have. Now, I've asked myself since then if I had known, if I would have not bothered,
Right.
because my life has definitely become much more complex. But I think that I don't think that anything's really changed in that regard for me, because I'd already decided when I made the videos that long before I made those videos that I was going to say what I thought,
Right.
more or less regardless of the consequences. Now, I've been fortunate throughout my life because, weirdly enough, the consequences of doing so have almost always been positive for me, and maybe they have this time too. That's certainly one way of reading it.
Right.
I mean, it's been a very nerve-wracking time for a variety of reasons.
I can imagine.
But I think you did a very good job of summarizing the full consequences. I mean, in every way possible, I would say I couldn't have, given the complexity of the situation, I couldn't have really hoped for a better possible outcome.
Yeah, I would agree.
So, the university backed off, and I wouldn't say that they backed off altogether unwillingly. I think that the public outrage that surrounded their response to me gave them the excuse they needed to leave me the hell alone.
Right.
Because to some degree they were responding to what they perceived as public pressure, although it was all coming from the social justice types who are very well organized.
Right.
And so they're very good at putting pressure on institutions because that's what they do.
Right.
But there was so much public backlash that they had a plausible reason to ignore them. That's a charitable view, but I do think there's some I don't think it's overwhelmingly charitable view. I mean, the dean that I was negotiating with, I wouldn't say that we were negotiating from positions of enmity.
Right.
He was an older guy. He's in his 70s.
I think you said he was pretty reasonable at one point. Is that?
Yeah, he's a reasonable guy. I think that, like most university administrators, he's too unwilling to stand up to the overrepresentation of particular interest groups. But it's hard for me even to fault him completely for that, because a university should be responsive to its community. When the community becomes pathological, then that sort of responsiveness becomes inappropriate. But
Right.
it's not that easy to figure out when that's happened or to erect defenses against it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Actually,
So-
later I have a question that's sort of tied to what you just said, actually. But I've got another interesting one, unless you have anything else to say.
No, go ahead.
So in this year's Maps of Meaning, I think it was episode 8, you made a very brief comment that I'm interested in hearing more about, and that's that you said that you are not a fan of the idea that of what some people might call like a technological transcendence. You say something along the lines of, in 500 years, we might be creatures that are not like we are now, and you don't think that that's a good idea. Or that's the implication that I got. It would seem to me that some aspects of our current nature, if we were to take that path as a species, I guess, would be lost in that kind of transition. But again, in my opinion, that's the loss and gaining of new, whatever you want to call it, is sort of the spice of evolution, and not necessarily such a bad thing. So I'm curious if you could elaborate at all why you feel that would be a non-ideal outcome.
Well, I guess the first thing I would say to that is that, and this is perhaps a reflection of the part of my nature that is conservative, is that there's a lot more ways for things to go wrong than there is for them to go right.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
So some of it's an unintended consequence issue, because generally what you see are the positive elements of something when you're trying to bring them into being, and you can't foresee all the negative consequences. Now you might say, well, yeah, but that can't stop you from charging forward, and there's definitely truth in that. I'm just concerned that by replacing that we won't notice what we lose when we lose the things that we think we don't need.
Understood. Yeah, that makes sense. Is there something in specific, I guess as a follow-up, is there something specific that, I don't know, this might be too obscure, but is there something specific that you feel would be lost in such a transition, or
well,
we just
one
that
of
we
the,
don't know, and you're sort of playing with fire?
I think, well, there is generally the playing with fire thing. I think, but you could say, well, we're playing with fire by staying in one place too. That we're surrounded by fire, and so
yeah, and an asteroid could come and
well, right. That's it. I mean,
right.
there's chaos in every direction in some sense. I mean, I guess one of the things that seems to have been lost to some degree so far is a non-trivial part of our individual time.
Okay.
We're so connected.
Yeah.
And it seems likely that degree of connection is only going to increase. And I think a certain amount of imagination has been sacrificed to that, because kids in particular, I don't think, are spending enough time in the kind of play that helps them become properly social.
Right.
But more than that, it's become very difficult to escape from the internet.
Yep.
And we're very fascinated by the technologies that keep us connected, and that's partly, of course, because thousands of geniuses are working as hard as they can, keeping us hooked as tightly as we can possibly be.
Right.
And they're very, very good at it.
Yep.
So it isn't obvious to me how we're going to negotiate the boundaries between connectedness and individuality, and where the optimal line should be drawn there.
Right.
And then there's other things that I'm curious about. I'm not a doomsayer in this regard, but we're also building this massive machine that is learning to understand us very, very rapidly.
Yep.
But it isn't going to be very long until it understands us a lot better than we understand it.
I would agree with that. Because
we're building these, like even these algorithms, that Facebook and Google are playing with to try to get rid of things like fake news, and we're going to build an unconscious into the net, and it'll be a filtering device. And so it'll present to us information that it filters in a particular way. And that's also, well, it's unparalleled.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I'm kind of worried in some sense this is hardly an original thought on my part, but it's a new kind of tyranny might arise, which is the tyranny of decisions made for us that we don't even know are being made.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And the other thing, as we continue to remove our limitations one by one, let's say, even if we extend our lifespans, which generally speaking I would consider a good thing, it also isn't obvious what we'll lose as a consequence of that.
Right.
I don't know how we would conceptualize our lives if we lasted 200 years. It's a huge...
It'd be a huge change.
Yeah, and you might think it would make our existential angst less, but it could easily make it more.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting... But to some degree, I guess we'll never know if we don't go there either. So, I'm not...
Well, it's probably going to go there no matter what.
So, right, right. Somebody's going to go there, some crazy person.
Yeah, well, and they're going there very quickly. The autonomous car industry is making strides and leaps and bounds. And that in itself is going to be an overwhelming social revolution. The revolutions are coming so rapidly that it's, well, it's hard to even say anything about it.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've heard at least of the concept of the singularity, that we will continue to rapidly change technologically until we hit this sort of critical mass that I think is generally associated with strong AI, and
right.
And then the world's going to get very weird, and we don't know a lot more than that, other than if we get there and when we get there, things are going to get real weird real quick. So
yeah, well, it's hard to imagine. I had a friend once who told me that if the logical limit to something appears impossible, then it'll never get there. Something else will happen. And I thought that was a very interesting observation, and I think he made that counter the theories of the singularity, because that, so basically the singularity theorists say, well, if present trends continue,
Right.
and
right.
fair enough, I mean, like Moore's law looks like a very, very stable phenomenon,
Yeah,
really
right.
remarkably stable.
Yep.
I mean, I know that what's his name, Kurzweil, has actually extended that backwards in time, you know, I believe either several millennia, certainly several centuries. So that's quite interesting. But many other things could happen to disrupt that technological
Absolutely.
flow. So, but
I actually read a couple of Kurzweil's books, and I found his extrapolations from this historical data to be pretty, maybe liberal is the right word. Like,
yeah,
it
well,
feels like,
they're post hoc. Eh?
yeah, right, yep. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I've got another one here. I've been getting into reading Jung lately,
Uh-huh.
Carl Jung, which I hadn't. I mean, I'm familiar with some of his work, but I hadn't really gone through much of it in book form, at least.
Yeah.
And I want to ask about some of his comments on the logos specifically, which I know is an important part of your work and your philosophy.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much of your view of the logos overlaps with his, or I'm not sure. But in the red book,
Likely a lot.
well, then I'll be very interested to see what you have to say. So in the red book, he seems to have a more dualistic and fatalistic outlook on the elevation of the logos. I have a couple of quotes actually written here that I'll
Okay.
read for reference. If one waits long enough, one sees how all the gods change into serpents and underworld dragons in the end. This is also the fate of the logos. In the end, it poisons us all. And then separately, some have their reason in thinking, others in feeling. Both are servants of the logos, and in secret become worshippers of the serpent. So those quotes are obviously taken out of some context, but they're interesting, and I considered, I guess.
Well, I would think the first one is probably a reference to one of Nietzsche's observations.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, because Nietzsche's pointed out that when he was discussing the death of God, and I don't remember where, it might have been in Beyond Good and Evil, that Christianity died at its own hands.
Right.
That
the truth sort of was the double-edged sword, so to speak. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, because the truth emerged out of what you might describe as a mythological background, something like that. And then when it woke up, it turned against its progenitor. Or the other thing he said at one point was that the necessity to interpret the whole world within the context and confines, say, of Catholicism, trained the European mind to think rigorously from a set of axioms.
Yep.
But once that training had taken place, then the trained mind could go off and do other things with it, including attacking the axiomatic structure of Christianity.
Okay.
And so I think that's likely the source of that first revelatory statement.
Okay.
And I know Nietzsche was a very astute student Jung was a very astute student of Nietzsche. I mean, I read his commentaries on Thus Spake Zarathustra. They're notes from a seminar. They must be 15 or 1600 pages long, and it only covers the first third of the book. Jung's
notes are 1600 pages long?
Yeah, the notes from the seminar he gave. Yes, yeah, it's crazy.
I've read Zarathustra, but I have not seen those notes, so maybe that gives me something else to check out.
Yeah. Well, they're quite the handful, but and then the second one. Read me the second one again.
Some have their reason in thinking, others in feeling. Both are servants of the logos, and in secret become worshippers of the serpent.
Yeah, well, that's a tougher one. I mean, the first part of that's fairly straightforward.
Right.
If you think about the logos as a manifestation of the exploratory / communicative impulse, then that can happen both rationally, linguistically, and also from the perspective of emotion. I mean, often people detect things first emotionally.
Right. Yep.
So you might notice this if you've had, like, if your wife has a bad day at work and comes home upset and you start to fight about something trivial,
Right.
and you unpack that, you'll often find that the she's upset with something at work only emotionally, and that needs to be unpacked so that she can find out exactly what the problem is. So she gets there with feeling first. I actually think that happens more to women than it happens to men, but I could be wrong about that, but I do believe that. But that's a perfectly reasonable form of exploratory behavior. It's just not fully articulated. So those functions of knowing, because Jung thought about both of those as rational functions and functions of knowing, can
Right.
both serve the exploratory impulse.
Yeah.
And the second part, worshippers of the serpent, I'd have to probably know more about the context of that quote. I mean, some of it has to do, I suspect, with Jung's continual attempts to play with opposites. It's like,
I like that about Jung, by the way.
Yeah.
I like duality. I'm a big fan of that theme. And
yeah, well,
things-
there's lots of, well, from a logical perspective, a thing can't be A and be not A at the same time. But the problem is that complex things can be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And so if what you could say is something can't be itself and something else at the same time if it's only one thing. But if it's a multiplicity of things, or a hierarchy of things, even like a human being is, then it can be itself and not itself and something else all at the same time, which is part of what makes human beings so difficult to deal with.
Right.
He might be referring to the read the last sentence again.
Sure. I lost it. Hang on one sec. Yeah.
Yep.
So both are servants of the logos, meaning
Yeah.
feeling and thinking, and in secret become worshippers of the serpent. In secret become worshippers
Right.
of the serpent.
See, it would depend on what he means by the serpent there, because, of course, it's also ambivalent. That could be the serpent that you're supposed to be according to Christ, right? Wise as serpents, but I don't remember the full quote. It has something to do, it's something like peaceful as doves and wise as serpents, something like that. And, Christ also compares himself to a serpent that was hung on a brazen pole that Moses erected in the desert,
Right.
something terrifying. And so Jung might be referring to that, to the terrifying element of the logos. He might be referring to the unknown, but I can't tell. From the context is too sparse for me to be certain.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, it looks like about 5 minutes left, so I'll be quick. I have two quick questions
Okay.
that hopefully we can get to. So I've watched both of your courses, the personality and maps, since the 2015 lectures, and while a lot of the ideas are the same across, you get to the same point, you seem to come up what seems like organically, and that's going to lend to my question, with really interesting and detailed anecdotes. So I'm not bored at all watching the lectures over and over and over again, because it seems like there's enough that's different.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be bored delivering them.
Well, maybe that has something to do with it, but
It does, because I'm not really lecturing in the normative sense, I wouldn't say. What I'm trying to do when I talk to my students is talk to them. I'm actually talking to them.
Right.
I'm not telling them what I know, I'm talking to them. I'm trying to figure out what I know and to extend it. And so I try to hit the same problems from a different angle every time I lecture about them, because it gets canned otherwise, and I don't like that feeling.
How much time? I'm curious how much time you spend sort of preparing for the average class, or maybe you do it before the year starts.
No, I'd spend time before each lecture thinking about what the central story is. And that's the most important time. That if I do it, I don't always do it, because sometimes I don't have the mental energy to do it, and then I'm more likely to kind of wing it, and the lectures don't go as well. They'll still go okay, but they don't go brilliantly, which is how I would like them to go. I need to sit down for 20 minutes and think, okay, what's the question here? And what's the pathway through the story, the basic pathway through the story? So maybe I'll put down like and mentally, maybe I'll put down 10 points in mind, but coherently in a story, so I know the pathway, and then I can riff on those
Yeah. Right.
points of stability.
And so, but the riffing is generally organic, it
Yeah,
seems. Wow.
that's right.
That's still,
That's right.
you seems you have a talent for it by my estimate, because though you do kind of go off into tangent land sometimes, it's always interesting in my.
Yeah, and most of the time I can bring it back to the main point.
Right. Yeah. Right.
That's the thing, is that when I'm functioning properly, I won't lose myself in the tangents, and that's why I need those 10 points, because I can remember, okay, here's where you are in the progression. This idea is related to that. You have to come back to the central theme.
Got it. Got it.
So yeah, it's kind of hard on students that really like orderliness and straightforward coherence,
Right.
but they're probably not the right students for my classes anyway. So there's other classes they can take.
Right. Right. All right. Last question, and this should also be a quick one. So, and this is just an interesting anecdotal question, I guess. So, you can have 4 people from history to dinner, like, current living or dead. Who do you bring? And before you answer, I want to tell you mine, because I think my answer, you would actually be, first of all, you're one of the 4 I would have. I'd also have Jesus Christ, Nietzsche, and Adolf Hitler. I'm not a big fan of Adolf Hitler, but I feel like you 4 at a table would be one of the most interesting things I could even imagine.
God,
So.
yes, that's quite the assemblage, all
Yeah,
right.
Indeed. But if you could pick 4, living or dead, who do you pick?
Well, I would pick Jung for sure.
Okay.
Nietzsche, probably Dostoevsky. Well, Christ is a hard one to avoid.
Yeah, I can't blame you. Well, we got
Yeah.
two. We got 2 of the same.
Yeah.
Right on. All right. Well, we're a little bit. Oh, I guess I still have 2 minutes. Do you mind sharing what your big 5 personality rankings are? Like, what are you high in? What are you low in? Just out of
Highest in
curiosity.
openness.
Yeah, me too.
Pretty high in extroversion, but a lot of that's assertiveness, like when you subdivide it. I'm going to put the Big 5 aspect scale online for people to use pretty soon with a detailed report. Neuroticism is a tough one because I have periods of depression, but
Right.
when I'm not depressed, then I'm very emotionally stable. So I don't know what to make of that one. Probably fairly high, I'd have to say overall. Above average for agreeableness for a man. Very industrious, less orderly, maybe average orderly,
Got it.
but industriousness is like 99th percentile or something like that. So that's basically my profile.
Right on. All right. Well, I will let you go a minute early. I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the support, and it was very good meeting you.
All right. Thanks. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right.